Okay, let's talk sandpaper. You're going to a lot of effort to make these amazing taonga that are precious. So we want to make sure that we get our finish right. When we're talking about the finish, we're talking about how smooth and how good our final outcome, our final product is looking. So let's start with our MDF prototypes. We're going to use yellow P80 grit sandpaper for our prototypes. Now the number on the back of sandpaper is talking about the grit of the sandpaper. When we talk about the grit, the lower the number, the rougher the sandpaper. Now the rougher the sandpaper, the more material it's going to take off. So this yellow sandpaper is P80. It's a rough sandpaper and it's going to remove a lot of material. Well, it's a medium sandpaper, but it will remove a lot of material. In contrast, we've got 240, P240. So a higher number means a much smoother sandpaper. So this is not going to remove much material. So you wouldn't start with this because you could be there for days trying to sand your shape. So we start with a lower number, and for our MDF prototypes, we are only going to use this yellow P80 sandpaper. That's because we don't want to spend too much time, just because our prototypes are more about shape and design and not necessarily the really fine finish. So a couple of techniques that you can utilize. If you put your sandpaper flat on the desk and you're trying to sand a curve like this, you could use this technique. If you wanted to get in a smaller area like this, you could tear a piece off and get right in there and sand like that. There's lots of different little ways you can sand. You can work those out yourself. So if we move on to our Corian, again, we're going to start with our yellow P80, our lower grit sandpaper. Then we're going to move on to our P240, but only move up to the 240 when you have got your Corian as smooth as you possibly can using the yellow P80. Only then should you move up to the P240. So spend quite a while on the P240 because that's going to give you a very, very smooth finish. And then our final step is to use this black sandpaper here. This is called wet and dry sandpaper. So we use this with water. So just to give you an example, if I sand it down on here, you can see the Corian that's clogging up the sandpaper. So what we do is we dip it in some water, we can dip our Corian in water, and then we can carry on sanding. Now the wet and dry sandpaper, we've got some 240 grit, and although it's the same as this, because we're using water, it's going to get it a lot smoother. We're going to use 240 and we may go up to 400 grit, which is very, very smooth. We'll just see how the finishes come out. But there are options to go up even over 1000 grit, although that's probably a bit overkill for what we're doing. So just to recap, we start with our yellow P80, and this is the only color the only grit that we're going to use for our MDF prototypes. With our Corian, we're going to start with the yellow P80. We're going to move up to P240, get it really, really smooth, and then the final step is to use wet and dry sandpaper.